Good morning, everyone. So I thought I would walk you through mostly work I've been doing for the last couple of years looking at data on how Pennsylvania funds its public schools. So that's going to be the main topic, and in particular the pattern that I uncovered and published about a pattern of systemic racial disparity in which school districts get more money versus which get less money. And then if we have time, I'll point out a couple of other things that I've also done in kind of the data activism area using data for social good. So I'm going to start. Let's see, how do I advance this? Probably have to go bring my mouse over here and then hit next. No. Okay. So I'm going to start, and I can make these slides available to you, so you'll have the links here. This work started about 3 years ago for me. I was starting to get active as a volunteer with Power, and it's an interfaith justice group working on 3 main issues, and the one that I got involved in was about education and making a great public education available for all students. And started in Philadelphia, and now it's really expanded across the state. And I ended up learning that 20 years ago or so, the city of Philadelphia had felt that it was getting under-resourced by the state in terms of public education funding, and that they did some analysis. I just happened to find this out talking to a neighbor who's a lawyer who works for the city, and they claimed to find a pattern of racial bias in how the state distributed its funding. They commissioned a study on it. It kind of was kept private, and eventually it died for some political reasons that I don't totally understand. But that was like 20 or 30 years ago, and so I said, I wonder if that is still the case. I knew that Philadelphia was really struggling in the amount of funding it was getting, but I didn't know if there was a pattern to how the money was being distributed across the state. So I really just went to the Pennsylvania Department of Education website and downloaded a bunch of data. Downloaded data on, there's 500 school districts in the state of Pennsylvania. Philadelphia is by far the largest, but there's another 499. So I downloaded the data on how much funding each of them was getting from the state, how many students each of them had, and various demographic characteristics of the populations there, including race, wealth, poverty rates, that kind of thing. And I started playing around with it, and I thought I would just walk you through what that analysis looked like 3 years ago. And just for a little context, at the time, Pennsylvania was one of 3 states in the country that didn't have a formula to determine how to divide up its public education funding across its districts. So in most states, 47 states, the legislature allocates a certain amount of money for public education, and then there's a formula that says how to disperse it based on factors in the districts. And the exact factors vary from state to state, but things you'd expect, like the number of students, for example, and how many of those students are special needs, how many of them are English language learners, how many of them are living in poverty, which drives up the cost of education, and they arrive at an amount. Well, Pennsylvania didn't have that. Pennsylvania, it was up to politicians, the legislators, every year to determine how to divide up the pot of money. So that was the case 3 years ago. You'll see as we advance the story, it's changed a little bit. But in any case, I started looking at the data, and let me, let's see, I can pull this over. So this is the report that's linked to on that link. So I pulled down the data on those 500 districts, and the first thing I noticed was that poorer districts were getting more funding from the state on a per student basis than wealthier districts. And that made a lot of sense because public school funding comes from 2 main sources. It comes from the state, and it comes from local, which is local sources, the actual school district itself, mainly by property taxes. And in general, wealthier areas can raise a lot more by property taxes, so they need less funding from the state, and poorer areas need more of their public school funding to come from the state. On top of that, as I mentioned before, poorer students come with greater needs into the classroom. They tend to not have the resources that wealthier students have, and it just, studies have shown pretty consistently, it just costs more to educate poorer students than wealthier students. And I found indeed that's the way it is in Pennsylvania, that Pennsylvania, the state part of the education budget, if I divide it up into the school districts into the wealthier half and the poorer half, I found that on average the poorer districts were getting about $5,000 per student, and the wealthier districts about half that, about $2,500 per student from the state. So far so good. That's as you'd expect. It makes sense. But then I looked at, there's quite a bit of variability in there. So this graph I did is just of the 500 districts, each plotting poverty rates on the x-axis, measured as the percent of students that are eligible for free reduced lunch, which is based on family income and size and so forth. So think of that as just a measure of poverty from the least poor to the most poor, going left to right. And from the bottom to the top, the per student funding they were getting from the state. BEF stands for basic education funding. That's the main state pot of money for public schools. There's some other smaller pots for transportation and things like that. So you can see this general trend represented by the regression line here, that indeed as poverty rates go up, the state is indeed giving average more money per student, but there's a huge amount of variability, right? For the same poverty rates, you've got some districts down here getting, what is that, maybe $1,500 per student, and districts at the same poverty rate getting about $8,000 a student. So there might be factors that are responsible for that make sense, or there might be factors responsible for that don't make sense. So that's what I started to dive into. And as I played with looking at different metrics about what distinguished the lower funded from the higher funded districts at a given poverty level, the one that stood out was the racial composition of the districts. So this graph is showing those districts with the half of the districts that are the whitest, colored yellow, and the half of the districts that are least have the most students of color, colored brown. And you can see this really clear pattern that emerges, that nearly all of the districts that are above the line are yellow, meaning the whiter districts. Those are districts getting more than would be predicted just based on their poverty rates. And the districts below the line are almost completely the browner districts, meaning districts getting less than would be expected just based on their poverty rates, and those are the districts with more students of color. So this trend was pretty striking. You sort of don't need a lot of deep statistical analysis to spot the trend here. To take away the two-color coloring, which is based on kind of a cutoff of just the median rate of percentage of white students, which, by the way, it turns out in Pennsylvania is 92%. So half of the districts in Pennsylvania are 92% or greater white students, and the other half are less. But there's a whole lot of very small, very white districts across the state of Pennsylvania, which you might not know if you live in the southeastern part of the state. If instead of putting them into two categories, this graph shows the same points, but just each point is shaded based on the continuous percentage of white students. And you see the same pattern, and if you kind of stare at it a little bit, you can see the pattern also that kind of the further above the line you get, the whiter the points get, and the further below the line, as a general rule, the darker the points get. So kind of the more white students, the better, higher the percentage of white students, the better the funding, the lower, the more students of color, the lower the funding rate for any particular level of poverty. So I wanted to then be able to see, in some ways, start to quantify this. And this is where I struggled a little bit, and I'll put this out at the end as a way that maybe if someone wants to take this on and think about doing something with this data, this is a question of how to easily quantify this relationship of how, quantify the difference between how whiter districts versus less white districts are funded. So this is one attempt I did to do that. Which is, I just broke down the poverty rates into deciles. So districts with less than 10% poverty, 10 to 20% poverty, et cetera, all the way up to greater than 90% poverty. And then in each of those deciles, I divided the school districts into two halves of equal number of districts, those with the most white half and the least white half of districts within each decile. So the exact cutoff is going to be different for each decile. Tends to be the poorer districts tend to have higher percentages of students of color. so the cutoff was different here. But basically, in each decile, I broke up the districts to the equal number and then compared what's the average funding that the districts that are the whiter half are getting compared to the lesser white half of districts. And you can see that across the spectrum, not just in the poorer districts, we're here, for example, in the 60 to 70% poverty rate, the whiter districts are getting, what is that, $6,800 per student, and the less white districts, $4,000 per student, big difference. But even when you get down to wealthier districts, in the 10 to 20% range, you've got this gap where the whiter districts at this pretty wealthy, among this pretty wealthy cohort are getting $1,700 per student, where the lesser white districts are getting $870 per student from the state. So to me, this was a surprise. I sort of wasn't shocked at the overall trend, but I was pretty surprised that the trend, and you kind of see it in the graph too, extends not only to poorer districts, but among wealthier districts, that more diversity in the district correlates with a lower amount of funding from the state. And I just, to play around, I did a different measure of wealth. Instead of using the percent of students in poverty or the percent of students qualifying for reduced or free lunches, there's another metric that the state uses in its computations of wealth, which is called the Mvp Age Ratio, which stands for, let's see if I can remember it. It's basically a combination of property values and personal income. So it's a way of measuring the wealth of a district as opposed to poverty rates. And you see that the trend is similar. It's not quite as pronounced as it was looking at poverty rates, but the trend is similar, that the higher this metric, which also goes from richer on the left to poorer districts on the right, you get increased funding, but mostly the whiter districts are getting above the line more than would be expected, and the less white districts less than expected. Okay, so I thought maybe I would walk through what this looks like and different ways that I tried to explore this to see how robust these trends were. Is that worth the trouble now? Let me just think a minute. I'll try this just a little bit, just to give you a flavor for one way of doing analysis like this, which is what I did. And oh, that's right. I was going to do the link to the website if that works. Let me try that instead. I'm used to my monitor being on the right and this one's on the left, so it's driving me a little bit nuts. Okay. It's not quite fitting on the screen right, but you get the idea. So this was a way that I was using this tool to play around with the data a little bit. One of the first critiques I got when I started showing this graph is 92%. What kind of ridiculous cutoff is that for the percentage of white students? Maybe that was chosen to somehow accentuate or artificially be biased in this data. So I put a slider in here that you can take this down if you wanted to. You can take it down to a lower percentage of white students as a cutoff. And what happens, though, as you do that, if I take it down to 50%, so these are comparing the districts now colored by those that are majority white versus minority white. And the trend is still there, but it's not as clear to see because there's so few districts that are actually minority white districts across Pennsylvania. There's, I forget, 20 or 30 or something that are actually minority white. And so in order to see the trend, if the trend really holds, you can take it up to these higher numbers. And for math literate folks, choosing a median is not an art. It's a pretty non-biased way to choose how you're going to divide up two groups. But nonetheless, I wanted to play around with it. And then, is there any point to showing? No, I guess this is just showing what I showed before, that by poverty, on average, the poorer students the poorer districts are getting higher funding rates per student than the wealthier districts, but when you do it by race, the whiter districts are getting higher funding than the less white districts. And you know, if you didn't, you might say, well, maybe that's because the wealthier districts are more students of color, but your intuition might tell you, or your life experience might tell you, that's not likely to be the case, and indeed it's not the case in Pennsylvania. And so the only way these two are reconciled is the fact that we have this systemic bias. Oh, that's right, and the other thing I was showing here, I think I forgot to mention when I was showing you this same graph before in the report, some of these were faded out based on the graph below is just how many districts fit in each of these poverty deciles. So you can see that like the highest number of districts are in this 40 to 50% poverty rate and 30 to 40%. And down here on the tail, you have few districts. You know, you have 13 districts, 9 districts, 5 districts. So, you know, the averages aren't as statistically significant there, but pretty much for everything in, say, from here to here, you've got a good number of data points. You've got at least 30 districts that you're averaging across for all of these. And so I think, you know, it demonstrated the trend pretty robustly. So if you, I'll send you, make these slides available. If you feel like playing around with this yourselves somewhere, you can. I also have links here to where the data came from, should you want to go pull it down and play around with it on your own. Just to warn you, one thing that changed in the tool I'm using, I had instructions here that told you how you can download the data, but they took away that ability, so unfortunately that doesn't work. Okay, so let me go back to my slides. Okay, so that was 3 years ago. And some news came out, around that time, just around the time I was doing this work, there had been some rumblings about the fact that Pennsylvania didn't have any rational way to divide up the money across the districts. And so the legislature actually created a commission to study school funding and make recommendations about a funding formula for Pennsylvania. So they went and took testimony around the state for a year, and I got to present testimony when they came and had a hearing in Philadelphia. There's an interesting activism story behind that and organizing. So if we have time and if people are interested, I'd love to tell you about that, but I'm going to stick to the numbers for now, and we'll go back to it later if there's interest in time. But in any case, there was interest across the country, and there was an article in the Washington Post during that year that looked at districts, looked at the states across the country, and what was the difference in funding per student between the wealthiest districts and the least wealthy districts. And again, they were looking at including both local and state funding. So my research, my analysis is only looking at the state part of the funding, but these graphs, we were looking at state plus local funding, and they were just asking the question, are wealthier districts getting more funding per student, or are the poorer districts getting more funding per student, knowing that it actually costs more, there are actual higher needs for resources to adequately educate poorer students. And what they found is there's a distribution of which are getting, the ones on the right part of this graph are the states that actually fund poorer districts more than wealthier ones, and up to 17% more. And then the left of the graph are the states that are getting less funding, total funding for the poorer students. And you see this outlier that Pennsylvania is like far and away the biggest disparity between wealthy and poorer districts, where on average, the poorest districts are getting 33% less funding per student than the wealthier districts. So an important part, there's two components to the reason for that big disparity in Pennsylvania. One of them is simply where the money comes from for public schools in Pennsylvania. In many states, it's about 50-50. Overall, the state provides about half the funding for public schools, and the local school districts provide about half the funding. In Pennsylvania, it's much more lopsided. The state provides only 34% of the funding, and the local school district provides about 60% of the funding, average across the state. It varies from district to district. But what that means is it's going to accentuate those differences in wealth across the districts, right? Because the state's doing a smaller part, the local municipalities are doing a bigger part, the poorer districts have less resources to draw on there to put into the schools. That's a big part of the disparity that was shown in that previous graph about why Pennsylvania overall is getting more funding in its wealthier districts. But the other part is, even for that state funding, how is it being distributed? So the good news is, there's one little good news in an overall kind of, at the moment, bleak story. That commission went and did its work, and they created a formula and made recommendations for a funding formula that says, this is what we, this legislative commission, think, having gotten testimony from all the experts across the state, this is the fair way to divide up the state's public school funding across the 500 districts. It takes into account all these factors that determine the real cost of educating children. Things like the number of students in the district, which shockingly had not been taken into account before this formula, right? So number of students, what are the poverty rates, what's the capacity of the local district to raise revenues through their taxes? You know, how wealthy are they? How much are they already taxing their people? English language learners, population sparsity. So if you have a rural district that's very spread out and has few students, they might still need to have 2 school buildings instead of 1, and that's going to incur extra costs. So they were very intelligent about it. They came up with a really good formula. It was actually unanimously approved by this bipartisan commission. And it was roundly praised by everyone, which is probably the last time that's happened in Pennsylvania politics. So that was the good news. The bad news is, when they enacted it officially into law a year later, the whole legislature decided to take this new definition of fairness, of how to fairly distribute money, and apply it only to any increases in funding above the previous year. They decided that and they actually coded, if you go look at the law as it's been enacted, the bill that got enacted into law, it says you start with funding districts at the amount of dollars they got in the year 2014-15, that exact dollar amount. Any increases above that amount get distributed through this formula with all these fancy factors for fairness. So the result was, as of last year, 2016-17, only 6% of the funding was being distributed fairly. 94% of it was being distributed unfairly with those patterns that I showed you already. And by the way, in the current year starting now, there was another slight increase, so there was another little bit of funding. So now it's 7.5% is being distributed through the FAIR formula, and only 92.5% is being distributed by the old inequitable way. So now that there was a formula, that gave another opportunity to measure the inequity in a different way. You know, the way I had done it before was just measuring poverty versus funding. And you know, that was, we saw that general trend that the higher the poverty, the higher the funding per student, but a lot of variation, and there was this racial pattern. But we didn't know there might have been legitimate factors that played into why districts at similar levels of poverty were getting different funding. Maybe some of them had a lot of English language learners, and so they needed higher funding, and things like that. So now we have this formula that is supposed to take into account all those factors. So now we can measure for each district, what does the formula say would be its fair share if all the money were divided up that way, versus what's the actual funding. And so this is what that looked like for all 500 districts. The x-axis is what the fair distribution of funding would be for each district, and the y-axis is what's the actual funding. This is last year's data for the 2016-17 school year. Again, you see there's a rough correlation among these numbers. In general, there's a trend that the actual funding bears some resemblance to the theoretical fair funding, but huge amounts of variation. Lots of districts getting a lot more or a lot less than what the formula says would be their fair share. And again, if you color those districts by racial makeup, it looks like this. And we see really the same pattern that we saw before when we did it by poverty, that the further above the line you get, meaning whiter districts, the more districts are getting, the more of a windfall they're getting over their fair share of funding. The further below the line you get, being below the line means you're getting less than your fair share of funding, and kind of the darker, meaning the less white students in the district, the more shortchange that district is getting compared to its fair share. And again, here's the same thing showing just in 2 colors to kind of make the pattern stand out a little starker. Okay, So let me think what I wanted to show you next. All right, so then the same thing, I had the same impulses last time of wanting to be able to quantify what's the impact, how can we quantify the amount of racial disparity that's going on? And now we have a better shot at doing this. So just as perspective, here are the 500 school districts on a map drawn showing the boundaries of each school district. You can see some are big, some are small, but you're seeing the area out by the outline. So here's a really big geographic district, but the size of the circle is proportional more or less to the number of students in the district. So most of these rural districts are small by number of students, even though they might cover a lot of area. Down here, you've got lots of bigger districts. So you get a sense of where they are. If you color them based on their racial makeup, you can see what those patterns look like too. So most of the districts across the middle and northern part of the state are predominantly white, and those in the southeast and western part tend to have more students of color, but you have pockets here and there. You've got Erie up here and different patterns of the racial composition. Okay, so then I wanted to be able to quantify what's the difference, what's the disparity in the funding between whiter and less white districts. So I did this a couple of ways, but I think this one was the one that made the most sense. I started by just ranking all the districts by the percentage of white students in them. So I lined them up from the least white district all the way on the left to the whitest districts all the way on the right, just ranking from 1 to 500. And they're sized, again, by the size of the students in the district. That big circle is Philadelphia. And then, having lined them up in order that way, I now added on the y-axis what does the formula say should be the funding of each of those districts. Okay, so for each district, this is how much the formula says would be its fair share of the years of the state education budget. And you see this general pattern that these least white districts tend to be funded higher according to the formula, and that's because they tend to have higher poverty populations and that kind of thing. And then it kind of levels out as you go across, not that much difference once you get past the 50 or 100 least white districts. So that's what the fair funding would be. Here's the same graph with the actual funding. And you see here, there's not so much of a pattern. The actual funding that each district was getting, you could maybe infer a little bit of a pattern here, but there's not a strong pattern about which ones are getting more and which ones are getting less. And now we can combine those, take what the formula says they should be getting, subtract off what they're actually getting, and we can compute that, therefore, for each district an inequity. What's the difference between what the formula says each district deserves as its fair share and what is it actually getting? So things with a positive number are getting more than the formula says is their fair share, and districts below the line with negative inequity numbers are getting less than their fair share. And here, since we've plotted on the x-axis the race, you see this really clear pattern that as you go from left to right, from the less white districts to the more white districts, you start out with the districts nearly all getting less than their fair share, and as the districts get whiter, they kind of almost monotonically get more compared to what their fair share is until you get up here in the whiter districts, nearly all of them are getting more than their fair share. And again here, well, okay, so here's a really, to me, this is sort of the clearest image that says this pattern is real and it's robust and persistent in a visual way. So then again, to quantify it, before I get to quantifying it, this is a strange thing I noticed. And again, if someone feels like playing around with this data and using statistical tools, here on the x-axis, we're sorted by the percentage of white students, but I didn't do it in this graph as a percentage. I did it as the ranking, 1 to 500. This next one is the same graph, but done by the percentage of white students. So where the points appear on the y-axis is identical, but they're much more scrunched up because of all of the number of districts that have a really high proportion of white students. And the thing that was odd to me is this graph, it's a little harder to see the pattern, but you can certainly see it, but it's not linear the way this one was. Oops, sorry. the way this one was. It's sort of perfectly linear, saying that like the disparity, the inequity in funding seems to be correlated with your ranking, your relative ranking of how white the district is. And intuitively, I can't understand why that would be, but here it is. As opposed to if it's an actual by the percentage of white students, it's a different relationship. It's not as linear, and why would that be? I don't know. So I just put that out as an interesting thing that if someone wanted to delve into more, they could. Okay, so I'm going back to the one that's sort of easier to see the pattern based on the ranking 1 to 500. And in order to quantify what the disparity is, I divided up the districts into 5 bins. As I'll show you in a minute, I played around with different ways of doing it, but the way I ended up publishing the report was this way. Dividing them up into 5 quintiles. Each quintile has a near equal number of students in it. Okay, so some of them have more districts and some less districts, but the same number of students. Okay, and then I can just take an average inequity for each of those quintiles. And so now we can say for the 20% of students in the least white districts, this is their average inequity, about $2,000 less than their fair share. And it kind of increases not linearly, but consistently to the whitest districts are getting about, on average, $2,000 more than their fair share of funding. By the way, let me stop here. I meant to say this at the beginning. Stop me at any time if you have questions or comments. I love if it's interactive, if you have thoughts or questions. Okay. Right, and this is the same plot again, just changing from between doing, oh, wait a minute. Sorry, no, this is something different. This is based on, this is using that rank 1 to 500 on the x-axis. This is using the percentages of white students on the x-axis. And again, pattern's the same. It seems to be exponential or some other function, which I didn't play with a whole lot if you do it by the actual percentage. One of the observations that people have made about the unfairness of funding in Pennsylvania during this long period when Pennsylvania didn't have a formula was they had this policy in place that was euphemistically named hold harmless, which said that a school district, as they did their negotiations each year of how much each district was going to get, they said no district would ever get less money than it got the previous year. So regardless of the fact that some districts were gaining in population over a period of decades and some were losing dramatically students over the decades, those ones that were losing never got less funding than they got. So 20 years later, they might be half the size, but they're getting at least as much funding as they got when they were twice the size. So one of the questions I had was how much of this disparity is due to that policy that's based on basically inflated number of students from decades ago when there was a different formula in place. And this was a quick attempt to answer that, which is I just took the total funding, and to get the per student funding, instead of dividing by the current number of students, I divided by the number of students from 1991-92, which is as far back as I could get the data. And the pattern stayed exactly the same, but the magnitude did decrease. So now the whitest districts are getting only about $1,100 per student more than their fair share instead of $2,000, and the least white $1,600 rather than $2,000. So that policy of shrinking districts getting more money accounted for some of the disparity, but not nearly all of it. Okay, so this is back to just taking those points of the quintiles and putting them into a bar graph to show what each, the least white quintile of students to the whitest quintile of districts, and what their disparity is relative to fairness. I recently got access to the data for this year that just started, the 2017-2018 school year, and basically they added a little bit, as I mentioned, they added like another 1.5% increase to the state funding, which shouldn't really make any difference in these patterns because they're basically keeping the funding from last year the same and taking that new amount of money and distributing it fairly. So I was expecting it not to make any difference in these average inequities. You know, if you've got the disparity, and if you kind of add to everybody, the absolute amount of the disparity should stay the same. Which would be true, except that when I did the numbers, I saw there actually was a difference. And the reason there was a difference was that the factors that go into the formula change every year. So the percentage of students, the number of students in each district has changed, the number of students who are in poverty has changed, and it wasn't obvious to me how that was going to affect these patterns, but when I looked at the data, the way that it impacted the racial disparity pattern was it got worse. So even though the kind of conventional wisdom, which is wrong by the way, but the conventional wisdom has been, well, all right, it's not perfect to keep that old money distributed the unfair way, but as long as we keep putting more new money and distributing it fairly, eventually it'll even out. It'll never even out because you've got a bunch of it frozen. But not only is it not evening out, it turns out that at least in this year, and I can't say if this will be a pattern going forward, but in this year, even though there's more money getting distributed fairly, the disparities as a function of race are getting worse. And I guess what that means is that the whiter districts might be continuing to lose population or increase in wealth, and the least white districts are continuing to gain population or get worse poverty or more English language learners, or that kind of, or those other factors that go into the formula. As a kind of orthogonal view at this, I was playing around with, what are the other factors that might correlate with this disparity in funding? And so I did the kind of most obvious one would be to look at poverty. And so I did the same analysis where I took the 500 districts and ranked them not based on race, but based on their poverty rates. Did the same thing where I divided them up into quintiles with equal numbers of students and plotted it. And this is how it comes out. So here we're going from the wealthiest districts on the left to the poorest districts on the right, as opposed to by race. And what you see is this kind of stark thing that the poorest districts on average are getting shortchanged dramatically relative to the formula, almost $1,600 per student, less than the formula says will be their fair share. But you don't see this monotonic, consistent pattern across the different poverty levels, right? So actually the wealthiest districts are getting about their fair share. They're not getting a windfall. The districts that are getting the most favored are the ones in the middle of the poverty spectrum. So I don't have a particular insight or explanation about this except to just compare it to the race and say, with the race, there's a consistent pattern that goes across all levels from the least white to the most white districts. The whiter the district, the more than its fair share of the funding it gets, and that's not true of poverty or of any other factor that I looked at. Okay, so just to throw out a couple of examples of how this plays out for actual school districts, I took 3 examples of districts in the Philadelphia area. Here's a comparison of Norristown School District with Iroquois School District, which up in the Northwest. Both of these districts, the formula says, as shown in the lavender number, their fair share of state funding would be about the same, about $2,900 per student, based on all the factors, on their number of the poverty rates, et cetera. And the actual funding that each of these districts is getting, Norristown is getting only $1,500 per student, so $1,300 less than its fair share. And Iroquois, with similar needs, is getting $6,800 more than its fair share, or $4,000 more than its fair share. And by the way, the racial composition of these districts, Norristown is 19% white, and Iroquois is 89% white. And the pattern holds for districts that are wealthier as well. Here's a fairly well-off district, not the wealthiest. This isn't quite Lower Merion, but Central Bucks District in Bucks County outside of Philadelphia, compared to a district called Southside in the western part of the state. The formula says both of them deserve about $1,300 or $1,400 per student based on all the factors that the formula takes into account. Instead, Central Bucks is getting a little less than that. They're getting $900. But Southside is getting this windfall. They're getting $8,600 per student, over $7,000 more than their fair share for this quite well-off district. And again, we see even here in these kind of upper echelon of districts, and this holds for most of the examples I looked at, Bucks County is 87% white, a pretty white district, but Southside is 99% white. And so even those differences in at the high end, at the very not very diverse districts, just having, and you can see this on the graphs too, just having a slight increase in diversity of students of color correlates with getting less funding from the state. And then there's just one more example of, this was a kind of an example of two districts that, oh no, I guess it's the same thing, yeah, that are, have similar funding needs, Quakertown and Jersey Shore, which interestingly, Jersey Shore is in the middle of Pennsylvania. Don't ask me why it's called Jersey Shore School District. The formula says they should both get about $2,300. Jersey Shore is getting $4,800 compared to $1,800 for Quakertown. And the white percentages, again, are 86% versus 97%. Yes?
Anecdotally,
yeah.
The three of the districts you picked are near the Philadelphia area.
Yeah.
All three of those were disadvantaged compared to the one you're comparing it to.
Yes.
I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, first of all, I picked these districts because, as I'm going to talk about in a little bit, how are we putting this into action? We're starting to talk to elected officials, and we started with elected officials in the Philadelphia area. So I was actually looking at the school districts that they represent and showing them how your colleagues in the other part of the state are bringing in way more money for similar districts than you're getting for your constituents. Is that okay with you? So that's why I chose these. But why is that? It seemed two things. One thing is that there's higher racial diversity in the southeast part. I don't know if you remember that map, but basically most of the state of Pennsylvania looks very white, with the exception of these pockets on the eastern part of the state, a little bit around Pittsburgh, a little bit around Erie. So it's reflecting this overall pattern that whiter districts are doing better, getting their fair share. And there's another factor, and this is really more conjecture on my part, that what you hear is that the Philadelphia and Southeastern delegation in Harrisburg doesn't have a lot of clout in the state legislature. That for whatever reason, even though we have a high amount of population in this part of the state, the legislature tends to be dominated by legislators from other part of the states, and that doesn't favor things for things like school funding. So as we start to talk about this, some of the reaction that people respond to this disparity, and it's kind of like sometimes you find an inequity and it's very complex and it's not clear how you got there and it's not clear how you would solve it, and you just sort of wring your hands and say, gosh, it's a shame it's this way, if only there were a clean solution. This is a problem that you might say, it's a shame and I don't know how we got here, but there's a really simple and obvious solution, right? The legislature agreed on a formula for how to divide the money fairly. Instead of putting 6% or 7% of the money through the FAIR formula, put all the money through the FAIR formula and you get rid of the disparities. When you start talking about radical ideas like actually distributing the money fairly, you hear things, first of all, you just hear, and sometimes this is just based out of ignorance, people know that the legislature passed a FAIR formula, so they think this problem is solved, there's a FAIR formula, not realizing that it has locked into place these historical inequities of the vast majority of the funding, and only a small amount of the funding is getting distributed fairly. They say, well, if you put all the money through the formula, it would decimate many districts, meaning there's these districts like that one I showed you called Southside that are getting way more than their fair share. If they only got their fair share, they'd get a lot less money in future years. And you just have to understand when you say decimate, it means they've been getting this unfair windfall for all these years, and if you did that, you'd be taking it away. And there's something to be said for not having drastic draconian disruption in funding from year to year. And I'm going to talk, I think I'll have time maybe, to talk about ways of gradually implementing a path to fairness so that you wouldn't do this all of a sudden in 1 year. So there are options for gradually transitioning. And finally, there's this argument that says people say, well, you can't harm some districts to help others. We should just increase the overall amount of money and never take away money from districts or try to even things out. And it sort of reflects this perspective that people who have been experiencing like unfair privileged status have an inalienable right to perpetuate that unfair advantage into the future. And it's as if it still kind of boggles my mind when people say, well, you can't take money away. You can't take money away from districts that have been getting it. And what's true is you can't take the education away from students who have already gotten exceptional educational resources and gotten a good education. You can't take that away from them, and nobody would want to take that away from them. But next year, when we're deciding how to divide up the state's money, nobody has anything coming to them more than any other student. Like, all of our students are equally valuable, and so let's distribute the money in the way that's equitable. And the basis for fairness is not what they got in some past inequitable time, but fairness is based on what are the needs and what is it going to take to provide a good education. Okay, so Michael, do we need to stop at some time to do anything else during the course of this class? Okay, and this class runs until?
Noon tomorrow, we're good. 12:45.
Okay, all right, good. So good, I thought I'd shift a little bit and talk about, I was thinking, I got two ways to go. I thought I wanted to talk a little bit about what I've been involved in doing with this data to try to actually affect change in the world. And then I also have another one of those dashboards to show you about kind of ways that you can play around with this data to kind of probe the robustness and different aspects of these patterns. Let me start out with this part, so what we're doing with change, and then if we have time, we'll play around with the data some more. So one of the most important things about this is just to get attention on the problem. People didn't know that this pattern existed. People are aware that their individual district might seem like it doesn't have enough resources, but they wouldn't have any way of knowing that this is a persistent pattern across the state, and in particular that it has this systemic racial component to it. So there has been now a bunch of press, mostly local press, but a little bit of more national press in the educational world, but also the Atlantic had a nice story on it as well. And then the real path to change is to look at the legislature and get them to change the law to distribute the money fairly. So this is a little bit of background of what the state of Pennsylvania looks like. Here's the 500 districts are colored according to what the inequity is. In other words, how much is each district getting more or less than their fair share? So the greener districts are getting more than their fair share, and the redder districts are getting less than their fair share this year. And the deeper the color, the more the inequity. So you see that vast parts of the state are getting more than their fair share. There's a lot of green there. But the areas that are red tend to be the more highly populated ones. So when it breaks down, as you'll see, to representation in the legislature, it's not so imbalanced. However, if you look at the districts represented by the top 4 legislative leaders in the Pennsylvania legislators, here it is, and that's really lopsided. So this is a real political challenge. You've got the top leaders in both the House and the Senate in Pennsylvania that have, at least for this, in terms of narrow self-interest of dollars coming into their districts, they have a lot of reasons to resist changing the advantaged position that their districts have been in. So that's one challenge we're facing. So we've been going to start to talk to legislators, particularly starting in the southeast Philadelphia, where Power operates in the city of Philadelphia. Power Metro is organized in the metropolitan region, the 4 or 5 counties around Philadelphia. And this is an example of some of the data that we've been taking to these legislators to show them. This is a state senator around this area whose district, his constituency covers about 10 school districts, and we've been showing them, here's the school district, for each of your districts, here's how much data, here's how many dollars it's getting from the state this year. Here's how many it should be getting if the money were distributed according to the fair formula, and therefore here's the inequity. So you got, in this particular case, this senator had 3 of his districts getting more than their fair share of funding, and the other 7 getting less, and you can just add that up and say, the grand total for that particular senator is, on balance, his districts were getting cheated out of $4 million that would be their due if it were distributed fairly. One of the subtleties that I kind of neglected when I first did this sort of analysis is the fact that the school district boundaries don't exactly align with the state Senate and state House boundaries. So I was able to determine which school districts overlap the senator's representation, but some of them overlap it totally and some less so. And I realized that just adding them up totally might give an unbalanced picture. And it turns out, so over here is the fraction of the school district that I got a hand from a colleague to compute this, who had skills in geomapping data. Some of the districts, like this one, Avon Grove, this senator covers 100% of it. Others of them have less percent, like this one, Unionville, he only represents 22% of that district. So I've been sort of playing around with what's the best way to present this to elected officials without making it too complicated, but wanting to present them an honest view of how it's impacting their constituents. And so I have these two choices. I can either give them that full number, or I can take the inequity for each district and multiply it by the fraction of the district that they represent to get what I think is a more relevant number, the fractional inequity. And so here's how that ends up for this senator. And it turns out that for this guy, the one that was getting the most windfall, he represents all of it. And some of the ones that were getting the worst shortfall, like this one, he only represents 59%. And if you add it all up, it ended up kind of flipping this guy from being invested in changing the system to invested in keeping the system the same, because if you add them all up, on balance, all of his representation is getting slightly more than their fair share by a tiny amount. It's about even. But I mentioned this just to say, like, there's subtleties in the numbers that you all can appreciate and that I can appreciate. I'm not sure that the press will not be able to cover this in press coverage to get people to understand it, and I'm not even sure how much elected officials will grasp it. And for me, it's a challenge also as an activist, but as a data scientist wanting to be honest with the numbers. How much do I lay all the cards on the table and say, well, the story's kind of murkier than it might appear, versus saying, darn it, we want to do the right thing. I'm going to show the numbers that make the story look as bad as it can. So that's just something I'm struggling with now. And I'm never going to hide data from people, but what do I put my foot forward with, and what do I show on the first graph? That's stuff that I'm playing around with now. So I mapped to all of the whole legislature, because one of the important questions was, is this going to be politically feasible to get a change made? If it's going to really, if it looked like that map did, where the vast majority of the state is benefiting and it's only a small minority that are getting screwed, it's going to be hard to appeal to the moral sense of people to say, we want you to get less money for your constituents in order to do the right thing. Maybe some people will go for that, but it might be a hard sell. Fortunately, when I looked to it, this graph is showing for the House and the Senate the number of legislators that, if you add up all of the school districts they represent, are they getting more than their fair share or less? And in the top graph, it's attributing the full school district inequity to each legislative district, ignoring the fact that they only represent part of it. And if you do it that way, in the House, 110 out of 203 are getting less than their fair share, so should have a vested interest in making this change. And in the Senate, similarly, 29 out of 50. If you do it the fractional way, it doesn't change much. It changes a little bit. It goes to 108 versus 95, or 27 versus 23. I did this a few months ago, and it was based on the 2016-17 data, and this was encouraging to me to say, okay, people don't have to do it because it's the right thing to do. They can just do it out of narrow self-interest to getting more money for their districts, and we should get a majority that way. Unfortunately, when I grabbed the new data for this year and did the same analysis, here's the one above is 2016-17, the one below, and I say 2017-18 preliminary because that's what the data on the website still says, it's preliminary, but I suspect it's going to be constant. Unfortunately, while the Senate stayed, flipped one person, but it's still majority getting less than their fair share. In the House, it flips, so it's almost equal, but I can no longer say that a majority of the House members are getting less than their fair share. It's now a very slight majority. And it's, when I looked into this in more detail, it's really pretty arbitrary. It's due to these fluctuations that have happened in the demographics from last year to this year, and these districts that flip from being more to less are ones that are just flipping a tiny bit. They were getting $50,000 more than their fair share last year, and they're getting $50,000 less than their fair share this year. They're kind of close to zero, but nonetheless, if you just do the numbers, it doesn't come out to a majority anymore. So again, one of the things I'm struggling with is how to communicate this. I lost my really strong, simple message that it's good for a majority of legislators, so I'm grappling with how to be honest with the numbers but communicate a powerful message. Fortunately for us, we've started to make some contacts in the Senate Education Committee, which is where such a change in law would be debated. And on the Education Committee in the Senate, there's 11 members, and of those 11 members, 7 of the 11 are getting shortchanged this year with the new numbers, all the way from, from here on down, that's the amount that they're currently getting shortchanged. So they have a vested interest for their districts in putting all the money through the formula. Another 2 are just barely positive. They're really breaking even. It's not going to make much difference one way or the other for them. And there's only 2 that are really getting severely advantaged by the current funding system. Guess who the chairman of the Education Committee is? That's this guy here. Right, so the chairman is, coincidentally or not, getting the biggest windfall for his districts. Okay, so I think I'll jump ahead to the solutions and then track back to look at this dashboard. If there's time, I'll go call it up now so it'll be ready.
Can we take a second to just check in with you guys? How you guys doing? Any questions so far?
My one question. So when you're quantifying inequity, you do that by comparing the current spending to what the formula would suggest.
Yes.
How did you, or why do you have so much faith in the fair funding formula that is like an accurate representation of what should be the case?
That's a great question. And it's especially a good question to ask for someone like me who, I don't know anything about education really. I don't know anything about education costs or funding other than I've been immersing myself in these numbers. So how do I know that's why is that the gold standard against which to measure fairness? And the answer is, my best answer is, what choice do we have? If we say we want to strive for fairness in how we distribute the money, then there's no mathematical formula that's going to tell you what fairness is. The best you could do is to get input from experts in this field, look at empirical data about how much districts spend and what their success rates are, what their outcomes are, and get people representing a broad spectrum and have them hash it out. And that's what this committee did in the legislature. Right? They were from both parties, Democrats and Republicans. They were from the House and the Senate. They had representatives of the governor. They took testimony from all over the state, and they unanimously agreed. I'm sure they fought it out. I'm sure they bickered and argued about should this factor be weighted heavily or less heavily, but they came up with this formula that they unanimously agreed to, and they said, this is what we think is fair. I think that's the best we can get as a definition of fairness. That's why I feel like here in the real, even though there might not be some absolute defense of why this is fair, in the real practical world, I think that's as close to fair of a definition of fairness as we could hope for.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions before I go on? Okay, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about how this thing would be implemented. Like I said, the kind of obvious clean solution is, well, distribute all the money through the formula. And as I mentioned, that has potentially dramatic impacts on districts that have been getting a lot different than the amount the formula says. And so I worked a couple years ago when the formula had just been recommended by the committee. It hadn't yet been enacted into law, and we were talking about optimistically about what are different ways it could be implemented that would both get us to fairness in a reasonable amount of time, but not have like catastrophic impacts on districts that are suddenly going to lose a lot of funding. So I had to make assumptions then about, well, how much money is going to be added into the education budget over the years. And at the time, there was a new governor elected who kind of ran on a platform of supporting public education. So I used these, what now turn out to be wildly optimistic assumptions of how much the education budget was going to increase. The assumption was it was going to increase by $400 million over each of the next 9 years, for a total increase of $3.6 billion. It turns out over the 3 years since then, it's been $500 million over 3 years, instead of what we thought maybe would be $1,200 million. But in any case, this is really just to illustrate kind of, again, another thing to do with numbers and with math about how you can try to play with different scenarios of how to implement a real solution. So the upper left graph is just showing the graph that you've seen already. All of these graphs on the x-axis have what the formula says should be the amount of funding per district. The upper left graph is what's the actual funding in that current year, 2014-15, and you see the disparity. And here's 3 different scenarios. One scenario is what they ended up enacting into law, which is freeze that base level of dollars where it is, and any increases get distributed according to the formula. And if you do that, even after 9 years of really substantial increases in funding, you still have the same racial bias pattern that you have today, right? And that's shown in that's the scenario 1. It has narrowed in a relative sense. You know, the points are getting closer to the line relatively, but you still have this substantial pattern of racial disparity, and that's because the absolute differences aren't changing, they're just getting diluted. 2 other scenarios are to phase in the formula. Scenario 2 said, all right, don't jump completely. Oh, by the way, the scenario I didn't show here is if you put all the money through the formula, then all the points would just be on the line. There wouldn't be much to see. Every point would be exactly on that line. If you said instead, we want to get to that point, that area gradually, so each year over the next 9 years, phase in an additional 10% of the old money through the formula. So next year, 90% of that money gets distributed in the unfair way it used to, but 10% of it goes through the formula. The next year, 20% of it, and in 10 years, all of it will be going through the formula. So that's what this looks like. This is after 9 years instead of 10 years, and almost all the points are along the line. It's almost fair. In fact, it's for all intents and purposes, you can call it fair. And finally, the last one was, all right, what if you just couldn't get it was just going to be too hard to overcome that resistance that districts have to getting their funding decreased, ever having funding decrease. How could you accelerate the path towards fairness without decreasing the amount that districts got? And the way you could do that is by saying each year when there's new money going in, okay, don't ever give everyone like a floor of the amount of money they got last year. But if the formula says they deserve less than that, then any out of the increased money, they don't get any of it. They don't, as opposed to this upper one that says distribute all the money to all the districts according to the formula. This one says distribute the new money only to districts that are getting less than their fair share until everyone's up to their fair share, and then it will get distributed among everyone. And you can see if over a period of time, over 9 years, that gets pretty close to equity too. Everyone's pretty close to the line, and then you have this clump of districts that are still experiencing, they haven't gotten any increases in 9 years, but they're still getting more than their fair share, but it's not hurting anyone else too much. And those tend to be smaller districts that have been getting these huge windfalls. So that seemed to be a pretty, okay compromise for how to implement things, but it's not the one they implemented. And unfortunately, not only isn't that the one they implemented, but even if they had, it wouldn't be going nearly on this trajectory because the budget hasn't been increasing by nearly that much over the years. And then this next one was just looking at how would each of those scenarios affect individual districts, and I won't go into this in detail, but it's just showing kind of year to year. We can compare, doing the increases by formula is the green line, so it would, things would increase slowly. If you did 100% formula, it would be the blue line, and here's those different scenarios, so you could kind of measure what the funding would be for each district over the 9 years. So anyway, I was optimistic a couple years ago. I was circulating these things, hoping it would have an impact on how they did it, and it hasn't yet, but we're working on it. Okay, so I mentioned a couple of things that if somebody wanted to take this further in a project that they could do. One thing is to do some work to try to isolate this racial factor as much as possible from other factors. And in particular, poverty is the notable one that we kind of know that there's some degree of correlation between percentage of whites or blacks and poverty rates in districts. I did play around a little bit with doing, say, some simple multiple linear regressions and was able to satisfy myself that the racial pattern held up even when taking poverty into account, but I didn't do it in what I felt was a really rigorous way. So if somebody wanted to look into that, I think that would be interesting to say, even when you hold every other seemingly relevant factor taken into account, how much is poverty, how much is the race factor still correlated with the inequity? And then it would certainly be cool to do this analysis in other states. I would love to know, is this a pattern that is observed nationally? Or is it something that is particularly egregious in Pennsylvania? And I can make a good argument in my head for both of those sides. Like, if you ask me why I think these patterns are the way they are in Pennsylvania, like, I don't think it's because you got a bunch of racist politicians in the room that said, let's disadvantage blacker districts, let's give them less funding. I don't think it happened in that overt kind of way. My theory about it is it happens in much more subtle ways, that districts represented by white politicians that are mostly white just over the years have had more political clout, and they're able to do more to get more for their districts, and the inverse is true of districts with more minority people of color in their districts. But it would be really interesting to see, is that a pattern that plays out equally across the country, or is there something about Pennsylvania that makes it particularly bad? Okay, good. Let me stop there. We only have a couple minutes left, so maybe I was going to open up that other dashboard. I'll show you what it looks like, but I think we won't really have time to get into it. So see if there's any more questions before we go out. So this, just to show you what you would be able to do here. This is the one that lets you play around, say, with the number of bins. So this is the graph I showed you that showed the disparity based on quintiles. And one of the things I wanted to play around with was see, is this robust based on how many bins you break it up to? So here's 10 bins instead of 5 bins. And again, you can see the disparity is like incredibly consistent. It's really monotonically increasing as you go up in percentages of white share. If you go above 10 or below 12, I think, then you get a few exceptions. I think if you go up to 15, it doesn't quite, it drops down here, and you can actually click on these and get the details of which districts that this covers. And this one, it turns out, is because Pittsburgh is an anomaly. Pittsburgh is a majority students of color district that happens to be getting more than its fair share. So it's an exception to the rule. And because it's a big district, whether it falls in one bin or the adjacent bin can change the whole bin average when you get into these smaller bins. So you can play around with that. You can play around with what do you divide it up by. I showed you the one that was poverty, that was white. I showed you the one that was dividing up by poverty. And again, you can see that you don't have that clean pattern here. By poverty, you can change different stuff here. So anyway, I'll let you explore that if that's of interest. And you can see how these things play out on maps across the state too, about how, like from the bottom, this is the, oops, I'm highlighting weird things. Oh, I see, I've got weird colors here because I didn't do 5. In any case, this is the inequity. Over here we're supposed to show the poverty, but it's not coming up. I guess the poverty is on the right. So I'll just point, you'll have the links to these URLs should you be interested in delving into these in more detail. All right, cool. Any questions, comments?
Does this include public colleges and universities, or is that completely separate state funding?
That's completely separate. Public universities are completely separate. Yeah. Michael.
I'm curious, if I remember a previous conversation that you and I had, one of the issues about bringing in politicians is that race for them was a problematic thing to bring into the discussion. I'm curious if you can offer some thoughts on that, or just recount, maybe just some what they said.
Yeah.
They don't want to talk about race, right?
Yeah, right. They don't want to talk about it, and it's a really interesting. So you're exactly right that the common reaction is, well, don't go bringing race into this, right? If you want to talk about fair school funding, we're happy to talk about that, but don't go bringing race into it. And the problem is, how can you not bring race into it when you know about this systemic pattern that the disparities are not just randomly distributed, they're distributed strongly correlated with race. And a lot of folks, in particular when I mean folks, I'm saying white politicians, are very defensive about this because they don't think of themselves as racist, and in general, I don't think of them as racist either. They're just people trying to do the best thing they can for their districts and even what they believe is best for the state. And yet, it is this real trigger thing, and no one wants to be called a racist. And what we found is, as soon as you use the word racism or racist, people's listening turns off. They're so triggered and they're so defensive that they can't hear anything you have to say. So we've decided, first of all, to never use the term racist or racism when talking about this stuff. We talk about racial disparity, racial patterns, and that kind of stuff, but never racism or racist. And the second thing is, as we go to present this, we are judicious about what message we present first. If we're talking to folks in southeastern Pennsylvania who are representing racially diverse constituencies, then we'll lead with this. Isn't this appalling that we've got this systemic racial bias? And that'll usually get a lot of energy going. But if we're talking to folks in other part of the states, we're more likely to just lead with the message of, look at all this disparity is. There's districts that should be getting equal amounts of funding that are getting way different amounts. Aren't all our children equally valuable, and don't they all deserve to be treated equally? So again, we're not going to hide it, but we're really trying to be thoughtful about what's the most effective messaging to lead with.
One more, I have a bunch of comments and thoughts, but we don't have time for them now. Maybe just one of the things I'll say for you guys is, part of what David has presented here that I think is really fascinating is, knowing David, but also let's all give him the benefit of the doubt and assume that he has the best intentions here. And even with that, there are choices you have to make about, as he said, how do you present the data, right? And this is really where some of that justice comes in. It's actually really easy for him right now because he's the sole decider. But think about taking this into the context of a big business, right, or a company, right? When you're in that context, how do you use your motivation towards justice to make those decisions when there's other people around you who dictate to you about how you need to be presenting it? I had a discussion with someone a while back about, I really want to make the world a better place, and they chose to work at Walmart, right? And somebody said to them, well, you sold your soul to the devil, right? And the response was a 0.01% change in Walmart's policies has a bigger impact than any nonprofit I can work for. They were working for the organic section of Walmart and trying to promote organic sales of organic food at Walmart. So this I think is something that you'll probably struggle with, through many parts of your professional life about, those choices. So I think that's a really nice, framing of that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's a good point. Yeah, good.
All right, let's thank our speaker.